Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi. As you can see, we are launching another live author stream this morning with the Permian Basin Adult Literacy Center. Good morning to you, and thank you so much for joining us. As you can see, our live author for today is Stacy Swan. Welcome, Stacy.
Thank you so much, Shelby. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is such a wonderful series, and today we have a wonderful author for you. I'm Shelby Landgraf with UT Permian Basin, and we would not be able to host this wonderful series if it weren't for our generous sponsor. A big thank you to Southwest 66 Credit Union for sponsoring our 2021 live streams. It always takes a generous sponsor to make wonderful community events like this happen. So thank you to you, Southwest 66 Credit Union. Stacy, as we dive in, please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you.
Hi, well, my name is Stacy Swan. I am coming to you from Austin, Texas, but I have a lot of family in the Permian Basin in Midland and Odessa, so it's always lovely to work with groups out there. I'm originally more from East Texas outside of Houston, and recently I published my debut novel, Olympus, Texas, which came out this past May with Doubleday. Prior to publishing my book, I've had a bunch of different jobs, actually. I started off always a love of books, though. One of my favorite jobs was I worked in a bookstore, Half Price Books, during college and in my early 20s. And then later, in my later 20s, I went back to school. I got my MFA in creative writing. And since then, I've taught college writing at a couple different places. I love working with students to improve their writing. And more recently, I teach creative writing, mostly online. And I'm a freelance editor where I help people with their novels and essays and short stories and give them feedback and help them revise.
You wear a lot of different hats, Stacy. Do a lot of different things.
Right, it's never boring when you get that variety.
Well, we love that. Before we talk more about your history, your love of books, your love of reading, and your evolution and journey into being now an acclaimed debut published author, with we being the Permian Basin Adult Literacy Center, tell us first a little bit more about your connection to the Permian Basin in West Texas here. You mentioned family.
Yeah. My dad grew up, at least in high school, in Abilene, and he has lots of brothers and sisters, and so I have aunts and uncles and cousins that are in Midland and Odessa. A lot of connections to the oil and gas industry out there. A lot of visits out there when I was a child, and yeah, I've always just been really drawn to words in general. A huge reader from the time that I was a kid. But working with college students, especially in developmental writing, which I've taught a lot, you just see how important it is to give people like faith in their own abilities to read and write. It's all about, how you're introduced to it when you're young. And a lot of times people, they think, oh, I'm just not a very good writer, or I'm just not very good at reading. And I think they're human skills we have, and they just take practice, but they also take encouragement. And I think when people start to write for themselves rather than writing for other people is when it really takes off for them and they're able to access it more easily. I think we all often feel better just from things like journaling and from reading books as well. And when I was in my 20s, I remember reading some of the works of Jonathan Kozol, who writes about illiteracy in America and education, and just starting to understand just the huge ramifications of literacy and just how the more people that you can reach, their lives become just exponentially easier when they're able to have greater literacy.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Stacy. You talk about encouragement, and that's so important for just about any dream you're pursuing. How did you find encouragement? And more specifically, how did you very first start writing? Was it journaling and in a journal that you just wrote for yourself?
Yeah, it actually was. When I was a kid, I think for one of my birthdays, like pretty young, like 6 or 7, I got a diary, the old kind that had the little
Yeah,
tiny key that you could lock, and
absolutely.
started writing then, and then, was lucky enough to have some teachers in junior high and high school that encouraged creative writing. And so I started writing, my own stories about things, and always really loved reading novels when I was a kid. So like the C.S. Lewis Narnia series. I was a huge fan of Encyclopedia Brown when I was in elementary school. And so that was just always with me. And then when I went to college, I was an English major, so writing a lot of papers about books, but took some creative writing classes there as well. And then for a chunk of my 20s, I felt like maybe I didn't know any writers myself. Writing just didn't seem like, a thing that was easy to do. Maybe I wasn't creative enough, or maybe I just couldn't get in the industry. But the desire for it never went away. And that's why I decided to go back to school to get better at creative writing. And the great thing about those programs, even more than the classes you take, it's the community that you're around. And when you're around other people that love the same things, and support each other, I feel like it's so much easier to not give up, because you're all in the same boat. You're all writing for a lot of years before you get published, but you cheer each other on, and that really helps a lot.
Absolutely. When you're talking about encouragement, what is your specific encouragement to someone who is maybe having self-doubt about, it's always so hard to get started, right? To first pick up that pen or to open up the blank document and just start writing. What is your encouragement to someone who is struggling to start, or who's struggling to find that inspiration?
I would say, like, I think sometimes we get too caught up initially in these ideas. Like, it's so fun, right, to think of like your book on a shelf in a library, those dreams of being interviewed about your book, but it seems so far away when you first start. So I always tell my students that, like, what you should really kind of hone in on is, how do you feel when you write? Do you feel like in a better mood when you're done? Does it make you feel like fulfilled and focused in a way other things that don't? Because I think a lot of people that want to write and it just never goes away, there's something that's just really satisfying that you can't get anywhere else. So focus on the joy you're getting from it, because like anything, right, it takes a ton of practice to get better and better. It's like playing an instrument, right? You can't expect to play a beautiful solo right away. So just focus on how much you enjoy it, and then naturally you're going to get better and better the more that you do it. And then again, like, finding a little community. One of the great things about so much stuff being online now, it's really easy to find free or low cost writing classes online, and those can help give you a community and give you like a little confidence, because other people are looking at your work and enjoying what you're putting out.
And your published work, Olympus, Texas, a novel, very Texas-centric, and we obviously here love West Texas, love the Lone Star State. What inspires you most about Texas, and why do you like writing about our great Lone Star State?
I am born and raised here, and I lived outside of Texas just for 2 years, where I lived in California. So it's the place that I know best, and I love writing about setting and landscape. I grew up kind of out in the country, next to the Brazos River in East Texas, and it just feels like a character to me, the actual feeling of the nature in the place. So it was natural for me to write a novel set there. A lot of the stuff I write is about where I grew up, the first 18 years or so of my life. And yeah, I love, there's something about Texas, right, that I don't know, when you're born here, you just can't shake the state pride, no matter what else is going on. And for this novel specifically, the kind of idea that triggered it was, I was thinking about Greek and Roman mythology, right? The gods and goddesses that a lot of us learned about when we were younger. And they're so larger than life, right? They're these big, immortal beings with big powers. But I was also thinking about Texas mythology, right? We are larger than life, right?
Yes.
Everything's bigger in Texas.
Everything's bigger in Texas, exactly.
And all the characters seem big and larger than life. And I thought, oh, it would be really fun to merge those two things. So to take these kind of ideas of these Greek gods, but make them regular humans just hanging out in rural Texas, no immortality or special powers, but just those character traits of the gods that make them really volatile and fun to read about.
Absolutely. Stacey, you mentioned that landscape and kind of the setting is almost a character to you. How do you go about developing your characters, whether that be kind of the landscape and the place, and then also your protagonist, your main characters?
Yeah, it was interesting in this book. It took me quite a long time to write it. So I tell people, don't ever worry if it's taking you a really long time to write your first novel, because it took me 15 years from the first idea and starting writing to when it was actually bought by a publisher and then put out. 12 years just to write it, and then a few years for the publishing process at the end.
A true odyssey, right?
Yes, exactly. I had to travel a long time before I got back home. And so with the characters, I started writing the book, and I got kind of stuck about 150 pages in, and like my plot just wasn't moving forward. I wasn't sure where I wanted the book to go. And so I stopped and I did kind of detailed character sketches about the characters, and I thought about not just what was going on in their lives during the week that this novel takes place, but also what happened in their childhoods, what happened 10 years before, giving them kind of a history, because, right, families are all about history. The things we do to each other today often have roots in things that happened in the past. And so in exploring that, it really helped open up the plot for me, and it made the rest of the book much easier to write.
So with that, tell us a little bit about the book before we get to listen to you read an excerpt for us.
Absolutely. So Olympus, Texas is the story of the Briscoe family. And again, they're loosely based on Greek mythology, but you don't have to have any knowledge of mythology to enjoy the novel. I wanted the novel and these characters to stand on their own, whether you're thinking about Zeus and Hera or not. So you have the parents, June and Peter Briscoe, and they're in their mid-50s and early 60s. They've been married a long time, but it's been a very bumpy marriage because Peter has had a lot of extramarital affairs during the marriage. And in fact, he has 6 children, but only 3 of those are with June, and they were all born after the marriage. So there's just been a lot of volatility. Their youngest son, March, had left town 2 years before. So the novel starts when March comes back into town. And the reason why March left is because he was caught having an affair with his brother Hap's wife. So clearly you don't want to stick around in a small town after that had happened. So he kind of left to avoid the fallout. But now he's missed his family and he's back home and he wants to make amends and see if he can stay in this small town.
So we've set the stage kind of to allow you to begin and to read an excerpt for us. If you're following along with your own book, you mentioned that it's page 18, The Origin of March's Rages.
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, I was investigating stuff from earlier in the family's lives. So March is almost 30 when he comes back into town, but I have these origin stories scattered in the book that kind of tell stories from earlier in the lives of this family. So the origin of March Rages, you catch up with the brothers March and Hap when they're 4 and 6, so very young. And one of the subplots going on in the novel is that March suffers from a disorder called intermittent explosive disorder, where he has these rages and anger that he can't control. And so what I'm about to read is showing kind of the first time that happened in the family. All right, I will get started then. March was 4, Hap was 6. That day, while at school, Hap had missed his brother. He'd been excited when, after walking the quarter mile from the cattle guard where the bus stopped, his mother met him by swinging open the screen door and setting an impassive March on the porch. "Go play," she commanded, before she went back inside. "What happened?" Hap asked. March shrugged, reached out, and gave their father's chair a shove, then leaned back against the house with a look he wore more and more often, one not quite angry, but not quite sad. Hap placed his hand on March's head, rubbed once, then said, "You're it." He bolted off the porch, calling, "All the trees are home base." Close to the house, the trees were spread apart, and the brothers were almost equally matched. March was already as tall as his brother, better at a sprint, while Hap's 2 additional years gave him more coordination. But then Hap headed to the cluster of cottonwoods farther from the house. There, March trailed his brother from tree to tree, never able to touch him in the half-second Hap traveled between trunks. After 5 minutes, March moved from calling his brother names, chicken, and then coward, to just grunting as he lunged. But Hap's elbow still ached from March's last tackle, and so he leaped to another giant cottonwood, his hand tracing a full circle around the trunk as he swung around. He stopped when a deep holler of frustration came out of his little brother, too big for his body. March was standing with his feet apart and his head thrown all the way back, raging at the green leaves 40 feet above. He screamed and screamed. Hap would have thought he had been bitten by a red wasp or a snake, but there was no pain or fear in the sound, just an ocean of anger forced into one flowing tap. Hap felt a little less scared when he heard the screen door bang. Their mother had come out on the porch. He slowly approached March and touched his shoulder. "I'll be it now," he said. March slammed Hap in the chest with his elbow, still yelling. Hap went to shove his brother back, but he stopped when he met March's eyes. He didn't even see his brother move. He just knew suddenly the ground was under his back and March was on top of him. It was probably good he didn't know he had decades in front of him in which he would find himself over and over in this same position. He would, before long, figure out the best strategies to extricate himself, but this first time, he lay there stunned as his brother choked him. This feeling wasn't like being submerged when he chose not to breathe to avoid inhaling water. His brother's small hands were so tight around his neck, he had no choice. His ability to breathe was out of his control. Just as he was overwhelmed with panic, his mother was there, grabbing March and pulling him backwards.
Stacy, thank you. Reading an excerpt from Olympus, Texas, kind of getting almost a flashback, if you will, a snapshot into the past of March. Walk us forward into your novel, of course, without giving too much away. How do you continue to weave both the character of the landscape of Texas and then these very rich, storied, kind of complex characters? How do you continue that?
So I just kind of like what I like to think of writing is like you're gathering all these characters together, you're getting to know them really well, and then you just kind of set them down and see what happens given who they are in that situation. So they all live in this town or very close, in the countryside around this town of Olympus, Texas. And so for me, the town is kind of also functioning as the heart of the novel. The way they all kind of bounce back and forth against each other, against the other people in town. There's also this idea, like, I think all of us that grew up in small towns know, like, sometimes you feel like you're on a stage in a small town, like all your secrets are known to everyone. And so they're all also dealing with that, like what the town thinks of them and the kind of actions that they're doing. So besides, so March gets back into town, right? He's got to deal with whether his brother will let him stay in town. He's got to deal with his brother's wife, Vera, who he had the affair with prior and is still with her husband. And Vera and Hap now have a child, right? So there's high stakes there and keeping the marriage together. And then in addition, he's got a friendship with Artie and Arlo, who are also Peter's children, but not June's children. And they have their own plot line as well, because Artie has recently started dating someone who Arlo doesn't approve of. So they are bouncing off each other. And then add to the mix, you've got Peter and June themselves. And as I mentioned before, their marriage is a little rocky. And June strikes up a friendship with a new large animal vet in town that she takes, that she begins a friendship with. So you've got all of that bouncing around together, and the novel takes place just over a span of a week. So a lot of things happen in that week.
A lot of things happen, and it's so easy to relate to in the sense that all families are beautifully imperfect, and I always say nothing's perfect on this side of heaven, and you can definitely see that in this family, and we can all see a little bit of that in our own family. I think if we're able to open our eyes, what do you want readers to really, if they were to take away one thing from this novel, what is your hope and your wish that they take away?
What I realized, I think a lot of times when we start writing, we don't know exactly what we're writing about, and we just see what comes out. And for a long time, I was like, oh, this is a book about infidelity, right? A lot of what's going on is around infidelity. But the more I wrote the book, the more I realized that I think to me, the book is about forgiveness and what what are the things that people have to do to get forgiveness from those they love. I feel like a lot of times in our culture, we put the burden of forgiveness on the person who's been wronged. So like you have to find it in yourself, and can you do that, for your own good, for the good of your relationship, to forgive another person. And I was thinking about how like there's also things that the person who commits the wrong can do to help the other person in that path to forgiveness. And I feel like it works well within a family story, because family are the people that, you can't just, they're not like a friendship that you can shake off, and move on to other friends. Your family is always there. They know everything about you. They've known you, from when you were tiny, which helps you, press each other's buttons, but it also means that there's a lot more at stake when those relationships rupture. So when people read the book, I think it'll make them think about, what goods can come out of forgiveness.
Yeah. Forgiveness, mercy, grace. It's such a beautiful message and a beautiful theme. It can be a very tough, a very difficult, challenging idea, but it can be so beautiful and so freeing. And it's so big picture and so idealistic. And I want to circle back around though to what you said about not allowing some kind of huge, lofty, beautiful, big theme to hold you back from starting. Because you just said you did not start with this, man, I'm going to write this beautiful lyrical novel about forgiveness, its power, the choice you have in forgiveness, the power you have in forgiveness. You started writing on a level that is a little bit easier to digest, or at least to begin, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like it's just too daunting, right? If you're like, I want
Yes.
to, in any, we want our books to like say something new or add something new to a conversation or to inspire people. And if you sit down with that pressure of like, I have to really make someone feel the power of love, or I have to make someone feel the power of like how violence affects people, like it's so daunting and it's so abstract feeling. And I think what's so fun about writing fiction is that you really get to almost like create this whole little world, and then you're putting yourself and your characters down in it. And I think that the most powerful writing comes when you're really focused on the characters and just watching what they do, putting them in motion, giving them conversations to have with each other, and your subconscious actually is going to fill in that thematic stuff for you, right? Because that's your personality and it's how you
Yeah.
see the world. And I often tell my students that your subconscious brain, your writing brain, is actually smarter than your conscious brain. So it'll start weaving in those big ideas about love or marriage or whatever you're writing about without you even consciously thinking about it, because it just kind of seeps in to the language, which is one of my favorite things about writing. It makes it feel kind of magical because you're not consciously thinking it, but then all this stuff is on the page later. It's wonderful.
Yeah. It absolutely does, to kind of trust your heart, trust your gut, trust some of those feelings. I want to talk a little bit more about your advice to current authors, future authors, aspiring authors. We've talked a little bit about your advice to get started, but what is your advice to someone in the throes of it? You said it that this project from kind of conception to birth was 15 years, 12 years actually writing this book. What is
Yeah.
your encouragement to someone to keep going?
Yeah, and I think it's like it comes back to that idea, if you know that the act of writing itself is what is making you happy and engaged and kind of looking at the world in a new and different way, it's a lot easier to keep going. But it's also where the community comes in, right? If I didn't have friends who hadn't read part of the novel, who didn't love the work that I was doing and were encouraging me that it was worthwhile to keep going, I think it would have been a lot easier to stop. So I always tell people, like, it's great if you can like find a little writing group, like find a couple of people in your community that really like to write, and then you all get together once a month. It can be online or it can be in person, and you share what you write. And I also think that, like, writing is such a strange thing, right? You're taking these words and you're putting them on paper, but they're supposed to evoke like the whole world. And somehow it's really hard to know how your own work is being taken by someone else, right? Because you can only see your own head when you're looking at the pages. And so I think getting outside readers for your work, whether you're writing like a children's picture book or a memoir or a whole novel, finding someone, even if they're just a reader and not a writer, who just lets you know, like, okay, this is what I got out of your story. This is what I'm seeing. Maybe this is where I was a little confused. This was my favorite part. And that is just so helpful when you're writing. I don't think I could ever write a book without a lot of other eyes on it, giving me suggestions for how to better achieve what I want to achieve, but maybe isn't coming across yet.
Yeah, that trusting that process and that interaction. Great question that you can just see popped up.
Yeah.
Stacey, thank you again. We're so happy to feature you today. So, what are you currently reading?
Well, I just finished a really beautiful novel that's not out yet. It will be coming out in, I think, in early 2022. It's called The Shadows of Pecan Hollow, and sounds very Texas-y because it is. It's a Texas novel, yes, by Carolyn Frost is the author's name. It's also set kind of not far from where Olympus would be in the real world. It's in that kind of like outside of Houston rural area. And it's the story of a young woman who gets tangled up with a bad man, and there's some robberies, and he goes to jail, and she doesn't get caught, and she goes on and tries to build a life for herself. And then her former partner gets out of jail and comes back and kind of upends her life. So I highly recommend keeping an eye out for that. And I'm just about to start reading a book that some of the watchers may be familiar with, Valentine,
yes,
by
Elizabeth Wetmore. Yes, we were able to feature her last year through the Permian Basin Adult Literacy Center. Fabulous West Texas connection.
Yes, yes. And I have heard so many amazing things about that novel. Like, everyone that has read it that I've talked to has loved it. So I'm really excited to start reading it today, because I'm going to be in conversation with her over the weekend at a writers conference here in Austin. So we'll get to talk about our books together.
How exciting. Well, that leads me to my next question. So, speaking of the future, can you share any current projects you're working on? Maybe give us a tease of any collaborations, anything that's to come that you might be able to share?
Sure. I have started working on my next book, which I very much hope will not take me 12 years to 15 years to write. I'm hoping for a much shorter window for that. But it's going to be set in Austin, which is where I've lived for a long time, but I've never really written much here. So that's going to be fun. And it's about a woman and her former boyfriend goes missing. And his friends try and enlist her help in figuring out where he's gone. So it's got some Texas politics in it. It's got a little mystery in it, and it's got a lot of Texas in it.
A lot of Texas mystery, a little bit of love. That has a little bit of everything.
Yes.
Stacey, final question for you to wind down. We've talked about your book, your encouragement for current and future writers. I want to end really big picture. Why is adult literacy as a whole so important?
It's really, we don't think about the ways that writing, just the things you need to read influence every aspect of your life. It's filling out paperwork for jobs, it's sending emails now for jobs, even just paying your bills, voting. like we are a country, in all of our culture, the things that help your family, the things that help yourself often need those literacy skills. And so it's why I'm always so honored to help organizations like your organization, because the work that you're doing to reach out to people and help them is so important. Because I know sometimes people, they're hesitant to come forward. They figured out how to live their lives without those literacy skills. They want to be independent and not have to rely on anyone. And it takes a lot of work to help people get to a place where just those things that should be easier for them are easier.
Yeah, such good and important work. Stacy, I lied slightly before I let you go. I know we are running out of time. We want to be respectful of your time this morning. Last, final, easy question. If we want to learn more about you, if we want to get our hands on your book, how can we get a hold of you? How can we support you and your beautiful work?
Oh, thank you so much. Well, if you go to my website, stacyswan.com, hit the contact button. I've got an email address on there. Anyone can contact me there. You can find links to me on Instagram and on Twitter if you want to link up on social media. And Olympus, Texas is available at, if you have a local independent bookstore. I'm always very pro independent bookstores, because they really are the hearts of communities too. They do so much work within communities. But you can also find it probably at your local library, or on Amazon, or at Target.
Stacy Swan, author of Olympus, Texas. Thank you so much for joining us this morning as we wind down and wrap up our time together. I want to again say thank you. And I want to remind you that September, as Stacy well knows, is National Literacy Month. It is a month dedicated to advocating and calling attention, as Stacy just said, to the importance of literacy, of adult literacy and literacy in our little ones as well. Permian Basin Adult Literacy Center is celebrating all month long for National Literacy Month. The nonprofit has a couple of events coming up to help you celebrate. There's, of course, the month-long Readathon fundraiser, if you're interested in supporting that. There's information on the Permian Basin Adult Literacy's website. And then there's an open house celebration. And, of course, you can shop for a good cause with the silent auction. That will be September the 28th through the 30th. So lots of ways for you to support adult literacy this month and the wonderful work that the Permian Basin Adult Literacy Center is doing. Thank you for your time this morning, Stacy. Thank you for sharing what a beautiful novel and what wonderful heart and themes that you were able to share. We're very grateful for your time.
Thank you so much for having me and giving me the chance to talk to everybody. And thanks everyone for watching. It was really a pleasure.
That's right. We wouldn't be able to have an event if it weren't for you, our viewers. So thank you again for your participation this morning. Thank you to our sponsor, Southwest 66 Credit Union. And again, a big thank you to the wonderful folks at the Permian Basin Adult Literacy Center. Have a wonderful one.